Okay, have a good show.
Thank you.
You mute us.
Yeah, Don, I'm just going to mute us in the studio here. Good luck.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a senior consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics that we cover are parallel to our project activities. So we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. So why don't we get started now? Today we're going to talk about wildlife studies that we're undertaking as part of the environmental and impact assessment. So this will sort of be a high-level overview of those studies, talking about the purpose of them, and just giving you a taste for what's involved in them. And then we can dive deeper into these as time goes on. So why don't we give everyone a, maybe just, what I like to do is just to give everyone a bit of a background on the project, just because not everyone's at exactly the same point when it comes to the project. And as a bit of an introduction, this Northern Road Link project is about a proposed all-season road that sits in northern Ontario on Treaty 9 land. It would connect the Ring of Fire, which is a major mineral deposit area, um, to the all-season highway network through its connection with the Martin Falls Community Access Road, which is another planned all-season road. And in doing so, it will provide an opportunity for one of the proponents of the Northern Road Link project, Webequie First Nation, to connect to the all-season highway network through their Webequie Supply Road. This project is subject to both the Provincial Environmental Assessment Act and the Federal Impact Assessment Act. As I mentioned, Webequie First Nation is a proponent of this project, as well as Martin Falls First Nation. And both communities sit around 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. And they are both remote communities, meaning they do not have all season road access. So they rely on the winter roads and the short time that those winter roads are actually safe and open to bring in supplies and materials. Otherwise, it has to come in by air, which is extremely expensive. Um, and as further background, there's been a number of historical studies on looking at all-season roads in the area, running to the Ring of Fire. Finally, in 2020, the province of Ontario, Martin Falls First Nation, and Webequie First Nation came to an agreement to work together towards building an all-season road that would connect the Martin Falls Community Access Road to the Ring of Fire, and agreed to conduct an environmental assessment and impact assessment uh, as part of that project. So that's where we stand now. In this next slide, we'll give you an idea as to how this project interacts with the two other all-season road projects that I have mentioned. The first is to the north, running from Webequie First Nation, from the airport in Webequie First Nation, southeast to the Ring of Fire area, east of Mukatayi River, is the Webequie Supply Road. So this environmental assessment began earlier than the Northern Road Link environmental assessment. So the east end of that road would then connect to the north end of the proposed Northern Road Link road, which then would connect with the Martin Falls Community Access Road at its south end, and that would ultimately connect to the provincial highway network, thereby connecting Webequie, the Ring of Fire, and Martin Falls to the provincial highway network. So the purpose of these roads, and Northern Road Link in particular, is to enable economic activity by helping to allow for the transport of goods, the efficient transport of goods, services, and resources from the Ring of Fire. Now, as I always tell people, it's not just a two-lane road. It is more than that. There is other infrastructure involved in it, and that includes, so the road itself is proposed at this point to be a multi-use gravel road. It would range in length 64 kilometers based on the alternatives that have been identified to this point. So once a preferred corridor, so a planning area, is identified, we will then know the length, more accurately, the length of the road. Right now we can give a range because we have a number of different alternatives, but we're working our way closer to having a preferred corridor. And in terms of water crossings, there are, as you can imagine, a number of water crossings. Most of them are smaller water crossings, but there is one very large bridge crossing which would occur at the Attawapiskat River, and that is a span of more than 200 meters. And then, as I mentioned, it's more than a road, and so there are other types of infrastructure that are associated. Some of them are temporary, some of them are permanent. So you have storage and laydown areas. These are typically associated with the construction camps, which accommodate the construction workers. You would have maintenance facilities and yards. These are permanent facilities, so these would occur probably at a couple of locations along the road. And then, of course, access roads would be required to get to another facility that's required, which is the aggregate sites, the areas to where the gravel and the rock needed to build the road would come from. So these aggregate sites, you have to get to them from the main corridor, so you would use these access roads, and associated with the access roads would be water crossings to cross any water courses in order to get to the pits and quarries. So there are a lot of pieces of infrastructure, or there are some pieces of infrastructure beyond just the two-lane gravel road. So that's the most important takeaway, I would say, from that. Um, so let's move now to our topic for today. And our today's topic is the caribou and wolverine. It's wildlife studies, but we're going to start with the caribou and wolverine study plan. And both of these are species at risk. So there's a lot of resources that are and will be focused on caribou and wolverine as part of this project. They've also been studied quite comprehensively, I can say, for the Webequie Supply Road project. And there's a lot of different activities associated with um, the caribou and wolverine study plan. There's winter aerial surveys and on the ground surveys for both caribou and wolverine. So the winter surveys would involve um, flying what you call transects, and transects are lines that are perpendicular at 90 degrees to the route of the road, and the idea is that these lines would be flown. So there's a number of these transects. They're typically spaced equally along the road at 90 degrees to the road. And these are basically flight lines for the plane. And then the plane would have in it at least 3 biologists who are looking out the window and making observations and noting locations. So they'll make observations on everything they see, basically, whether it's caribou, whether it might happen to be a wolverine, it could be lynx or moose, anything really. And it's the winter caribou surveys are typically done in February. Uh, um, there's very sort of strict conditions. There need to be sunny conditions. So it's done in February where there's snow cover and with the sun out, so that the tracks can be seen very easily. And so this is how these surveys are typically conducted. There is There's also a caribou nursery habitat survey that is done, will be done, or has been done as part of this work. And that survey basically looks at possible areas where caribou might use that caribou might use for nursery habitat. So this is to both calve or like give birth to and take care of their young. So these areas have certain characteristics. So our team of biologists would look at the map and identify potential areas, and then go out and actually do surveys of these areas to look for evidence of as to whether they are nursery habitat areas. And we also are doing caribou GPS collaring, and that's a really interesting exercise where a number of caribou are captured and collared. So the collar that's placed around them has a location, emits a signal that allows the location to be identified, geographic location of the caribou to be identified. And when the animal is captured, there's blood samples and hair samples taken to understand whether it's an eastern migratory caribou or a boreal caribou, and also to measure levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, to understand if the animal has been experiencing long-term stress. So that's the GPS collaring is something that goes on typically, I think, for 3 years. So it allows the scientists and biologists to be able to track the location of the animals over those 3 years and see and follow their behavior at different times of year. So it's pretty interesting. I think our collars, the collars on our collared caribou, are actually coming off this month. The animals, because they actually come off on their own after a period of time. So we're going to be able to start diving into the data associated with those captured caribou and see what information we can glean from that. Also, we're doing what's called a wolverine occupancy survey, and this involves, and you may have seen this on the Webquay Supply Road project, the construction of a sort of a wooden frame, which is set up with cameras, wildlife cameras, opposite the frame, and then there's a wire that dangles a large piece of meat that the wolverine is interested in. So the idea is that it would climb this wooden apparatus and stand up and try and reach over and grab the meat that's hanging there slightly out of its reach. And in doing that, we're able to get good photos of wolverine, identify whether they're male or female, and any distinct characteristics, and that helps us identify how many individuals we think are occupying the study area. So lots of really interesting information I know from the Webquay Supply Road project. Some great photos. I think you've been seeing some of the photos. They've been posted on your screen there of the wolverine actually reaching. There we are, reaching for the meat. So a lot of information. These are very interesting animals, and they have very large ranges as well too. So lots of activities. It's hard to really describe everything that's involved in the caribou and wolverine study plan all in sort of one slide, but this will at least give you a bit of a start. Let's move on now to a more general study plan, which is the wildlife and wildlife habitat study plan. And the purpose of this plan is to get a better understanding of the biodiversity, so the richness of species, the number of different species, and the abundance, how many, the life cycle, seasonal ranges, so where do they go from season to season and within seasons, migration patterns, and then the sensitive periods, such as breeding seasons for most of the wildlife species in the study area. Again, this all comes back to us needing to understand the baseline, right? So establishing that baseline of information, that snapshot about all these different disciplines, whether it's wildlife, whether it's fish and fish habitat. We need to understand the way things are now, how things work now, and in order to be able to identify potential impacts of the project. And then if we identify potential impacts, we can identify perhaps ways to mitigate or reduce those impacts. So there's a number of activities um, associated with the wildlife and wildlife habitat study plan. Again, there's the winter surveys on, when we do the aerial surveys, they're not just for caribou. We also make, as I mentioned, observations on moose and gray wolf and lynx and bear. Although there's typically not bears out at that time of year in the winter, they're hibernating. We also do bat acoustic surveys. So this is where we would set up sort of devices that would detect um, noises or emissions given out by bats, so that we can use that information to understand if the area is frequented by different species of bats, and just get an understanding as to what is going on. Again, taking that picture and that getting that snapshot of what is going on in the study area, so that we're informed and that we can think about the project activities and then project as to whether we think that they might cause disturbance. Whether it's during construction or operation, would that disturb the way things are? And the way things are, that picture is painted by doing the baseline investigations. And then we also do acoustic surveys on reptiles and amphibians. Um, and acoustic meaning basically uh, listening. So listening for calls and recording information, setting up recording devices to understand which reptiles and amphibians are there, and what they might be doing as well too. So there's a lot of activities. Again, this is just scratching the surface of those activities, but that gives you a bit of an idea. And then next is the species at risk study plan. And um, what this does, the purpose of this is to identify possible impacts on species at risk within the study area. And so there are a number of species at risk that sit within the study area. These include wolverine and caribou, and that's both boreal and eastern migratory populations of caribou. Remember, the eastern migratory caribou have a much larger range, up to 1,000 kilometers, if not more. They use the tundra and subtundra areas as well as the boreal areas um, during the course of a year, while the boreal caribou stay in the boreal forest, and they don't go beyond that. They have much smaller ranges. They look almost like identical. They can be differentiated by genetic testing, although I can tell you that many community members that we've talked to know the difference between they do notice a difference between the eastern migratory and boreal caribou as well. Other species at risk in the area include bald eagles, barn swallows, bank swallows, Canada warbler, a lot of birds as you can tell, common nighthawk, evening grosbeak, rusty blackbird, olive-sided flycatcher, yellow rail, and then little brown myotis, which is a species of bat, and then lake sturgeon, uh, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So those are the species at risk. And then some of the activities associated with this, again, we talked about this earlier, the caribou GPS collaring, the wolverine occupancy study, aerial surveys, like these winter aerial surveys for caribou and other types of large wildlife. Field surveys, many different types of field surveys. We'll get into them for the birds next. And then there's also another activity which is kind of hard to describe, but it's once the data is collected, it's trying to understand it better and get a feel for it. So you do things called you do activities called modeling, where you look at where the observations were and you try to come up with what you call inferences, I guess, which is try to identify where it looks like the a particular species tends to be. So the geographic distribution of a species, and then the abundance of the species too, based on the observations as well too. If you had 10 over here and then 5 over here, and you start being able to predict, it usually it correlates, or it usually is connected to the habitat types of the area as well too. So um, that's generally what's involved in a species at risk study plan. And then next, we are going to talk about the breeding bird study plan. So the breeding bird study plan, again, this is another major activity. The purpose of this is to describe the biodiversity of birds and their habitats in the project study area. So this includes all different types of birds, whether it's raptors, which are birds of prey, shorebirds, waterfowl, bog and fen birds, so birds that are in those muskeg type areas, and then wetland birds. So there's a lot of focus on birds as part of the environmental and impact assessments, including point count surveys where a biologist would go to a particular location, specific location, and observe for a period of time and then record their observations based on the calls that they're hearing and what they're seeing as well. There's acoustic bird sampling where you're listening and then you're going through, um, typically going through the recording of what's been collected through the listening devices. There's what you call, and I love this word, crepuscular dusk dawn bird surveys. So crepuscular means dusk or dawn. So birds that are active just before um, nightfall or just before first light of the day in the dawn. There's also waterfowl migration aerial surveys. So this is done typically in the migratory period, um, where the team would be flying over staging areas where the waterfowl might come down to feed or rest for a period of time before continuing their migration further north. So we do surveys where we do estimated counts in these areas. Shorebird migration aerial surveys, we do those as well as part of this work, and then raptor nesting data collection. And a lot of that work is done through incidental observations, but I think a lot of it is collected from the winter aerial surveys, because as you know, the raptor nests or the bird of prey nests like bald eagle nests or osprey nests are large stick nests, and they're typically very high up, so they can be spotted fairly easy from a plane flying at low altitude. So we often record these nest locations as part of doing the winter surveys. So um, that wraps up today's presentation. Uh, Lots of information to talk about. We're going to be doing more presentations that drill a little bit more deeply into these different wildlife studies that are being undertaken. This was sort of an initial overview, and we look forward to diving in with you in a little bit more detail as well. So That wraps up today's discussion of the wildlife studies. We hope this was helpful. We hope it encourages you to join us again next week when we talk about the vegetation studies. So don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on the website, northernroadlink.ca. There's a lot of information available there. We welcome you to go there. We record these streaming sessions, these live streams, and make them available. You can see the contact information on your screen right now. And so we will see you again next week, same time, same place. Miigwech, and make sure to look out for project updates and look for our social media posts as well. So we will see you again next week. Miigwech.